As the sun dipped low outside the tall windows of the Maplewood Estates courtroom, casting elongated shadows across the polished wood floors, every person present could feel that the final act of this intense legal drama was about to unfold. And David, seated with a quiet, controlled confidence, rose one last time to address the court, knowing that the culmination of months of meticulous research, sleepless nights, and careful strategy had brought him to this very moment where every word, every piece of evidence, every subtle reference to procedural law and neighborhood bylaws would count more than ever. Judge Whitaker, visibly tense and aware that the gallery's eyes were fixed upon him, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, attempting to assert authority, but the courtroom had shifted. The momentum no longer under his control, because David's presentation had not only discredited the HOA board and exposed their selective enforcement and financial misconduct, but had also illuminated systemic flaws that even the judge could not ignore without risking public scrutiny. And as David began, his voice steady, yet carrying the weight of undeniable logic, recounted every instance of injustice his family had endured, from the arbitrary fines for trivial lawn infractions to the malicious targeting that revealed a pattern of racial bias, and then pivoted seamlessly to the verified financial evidence showing Martha Clarkson and her accomplices funneling HOA funds into personal accounts while simultaneously issuing fines to families like the Johnsons, documented, highlighting dates, amounts, and the direct correlation between their abuse of power and the financial and emotional harm inflicted on innocent neighbors. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as people recognized the audacity of the HOA board's actions and the brilliance of David's strategy, for he had not only collected undeniable proof, but had framed it in a way that left no room for plausible deniability. And as he laid out the final timeline connecting fines, intimidation, and financial malfeasance, he emphasized that the Johnsons' fight was emblematic of a broader struggle against unchecked HOA authority, systemic oversight failures, and judicial complacency, transforming the courtroom from a local dispute into a symbolic battleground for justice and equity within the community. And when he concluded, stating calmly but firmly that the board's actions were illegal, discriminatory, and required immediate corrective action, the atmosphere was electric with tension, anticipation, and the thrill of witnessing a teenager dismantle entrenched power with nothing but intellect, preparation, and moral clarity. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, visibly grappling with the unprecedented scope of David's presentation, and called for a brief recess to review the evidence. But the whispers and gasps of the audience continued unabated, neighbors exchanging looks of disbelief and admiration, reporters hurriedly scribbling notes for the story of the year, and even the board members, who had once exuded confidence and control, now sat slumped in their chairs, their faces pale, realizing that the meticulous legal web David had spun left them exposed, vulnerable, and unable to mount an effective defense. When the session resumed, David introduced his final witnesses, including a respected neighborhood attorney who testified to the board's procedural violations, and a former HOA member who provided a first-hand account of the deliberate targeting of minority homeowners. And with each testimony, the narrative solidified. The HOA's actions were not isolated mistakes, but a pattern of calculated misconduct designed to intimidate, exploit, and marginalize, and David's precise questioning exposed every inconsistency, hesitation, and false statement, leaving the board unable to respond coherently. Their attempts to shift blame or downplay the evidence crumbling under the weight of facts. Then came the moment David had anticipated and prepared for meticulously. The judge, compelled to acknowledge the mounting evidence and the moral imperative, addressed the courtroom, declaring that the HOA fines against the Johnson family were null and void, that Martha Clarkson and implicated board members would be held accountable for misappropriation of funds, and that oversight measures would be implemented to prevent any future abuse. And as he spoke, the courtroom erupted into applause, some neighbors even rising to their feet, a rare acknowledgement of justice being served. And in that moment, David's family exchanged glances filled with relief, pride, and awe, For the teenager they had known had grown into a legal force capable of dismantling a seemingly untouchable power structure through sheer intellect, preparation, and courage. Martha Clarkson, her face drained of color, attempted a last-minute objection. But it was overruled, her credibility shattered, and the board's authority permanently diminished. While the judge, visibly humbled, nodded at David, an unspoken acknowledgement that the courtroom had witnessed not just a legal victory, but the triumph of integrity and diligence over arrogance and abuse. And as the gavel came down one final time, signaling the official end of the case, the Johnsons' neighbors filed out, some pausing to congratulate David, others to shake their heads in disbelief at the audacity and brilliance displayed. The story quickly spread beyond Maplewood Estates, capturing headlines, inspiring community activism, and demonstrating that knowledge, courage, and moral clarity could overcome even deeply entrenched prejudice and power. And as the courtroom emptied, David quietly gathered his notes, a faint smile on his lips, knowing that justice had been served not through aggression or vengeance, but through intelligence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to what was right, and that his victory had set a precedent that would ripple through the community for years, ensuring that no HOA, no board, and no individual could again wield unchecked authority over neighbors without accountability, leaving an indelible mark on Maplewood Estates and proving beyond doubt that even a teenager, underestimated by all, could become the embodiment of legal genius and moral fortitude. And that day, the Johnson family reclaimed not only their home and peace of mind, but also restored a sense of fairness, dignity, and hope for the entire community, solidifying David's legacy as the young attorney who had turned the tables on injustice with brilliance, courage, and an unwavering sense of right, leaving the final image of the courtroom etched into everyone's memory, a young man standing tall, the gavel echoing behind him, a defeated HOA board, a humbled judge, and a neighborhood forever changed, inspired, and awakened to the power of truth, intellect, and justice. The courtroom reconvened after the recess with an energy so thick it felt almost tangible, as if every person present, neighbors, reporters, even the attorneys could sense that the tides had irrevocably shifted, and when Judge Whitaker entered, his expression was tighter than ever, lines etched across his face, betraying the unease he felt despite his attempts to appear in control. David, meanwhile, sat perfectly composed at the defense table, fingers interlaced over the open binder in front of him, eyes flicking calmly to the judge and then to Martha Clarkson, whose shoulders had slumped slightly during the break. Her once proud aura diminished, her confidence visibly shaken by the meticulous destruction of her arguments. And as the judge called the session to order, David rose once more, this time with a purpose sharper than any previous display. Because he had spent the recess gathering not only his own notes, but carefully reviewing a set of court transcripts from prior HOA cases that revealed inconsistencies, potential conflicts of interest, and even misconduct by Judge Whitaker himself, tales that could transform this courtroom from a mere venue of confrontation into a stage for the unmasking of systemic abuse. Your Honor, David began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of calculated authority. Before we proceed further with the board's claims, I request permission to bring to the court's attention a series of prior rulings, including Maplewood Estates v. Reynolds, which demonstrate patterns of selective enforcement and raise serious questions about past decisions overseen by this court, particularly in instances where HOA fines disproportionately targeted minority homeowners, and I have obtained verified transcripts and evidence highlighting these disparities. The judge's eyes flickered briefly to the court clerk, who shifted nervously, and a low murmur spread through the courtroom as the gallery sensed the gravity of what David had just proposed. Because it was no longer just about the Johnson family. Integrity of past rulings, the credibility of the very system, was being called into question. Martha Clarkson's face turned ashen, and she clutched her pearls tightly as though they could anchor her sanity against the storm David was about to unleash, while her fellow board members exchanged panicked glances, whispering urgently among themselves. Realizing that their once solid control over the neighborhood was disintegrating before the eyes of everyone present. David continued without hesitation, sliding a thick folder toward the judge and pointing to highlighted passages that documented not only selective enforcement, but also incidents in which fines were issued without proper notice, without votes, and without adherence to the procedural rules mandated by the HOA bylaws. And then he pressed forward, his words crisp and deliberate. Your Honor, these patterns suggest a troubling history of oversight, or lack thereof, that has resulted in a disproportionate and unlawful burden on certain families, including my own, and I respectfully request that the court consider the implications of these findings when evaluating the board's claims against us. A heavy silence followed, punctuated only by the scribbling of notes and the occasional camera click, as the judge adjusted his glasses, clearly unnerved. While Martha's lips trembled as she muttered something under her breath, realizing for the first time that David's strategy was not simply to defend his family, but to expose every flaw in the foundation of the HOA's power, and even in the judicial oversight that had long allowed it to operate unchecked. When David called his next piece of evidence a series of emails obtained through public records requests, showing that certain board members, including Martha, had deliberately hidden fines from the official records, and that there had been explicit discussion of targeting families based on their race, the courtroom erupted, the gallery audibly gasping as the full weight of the misconduct became clear. Even the judge's normally stoic expression flickered with discomfort, and reporters leaned forward, sensing the story of the year unfolding live before them. Martha Clarkson tried desperately to interject, shouting that these documents were irrelevant, that they were fabricated, but David anticipated her objections, calmly holding up certified copies and saying, "All documents submitted are verified through official channels, Your Honor. We are not relying on hearsay or speculation, but on primary evidence that exposes deliberate wrongdoing." The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but the momentum was no longer his. The gallery's murmurs had swelled into a chorus of acknowledgement, neighbors nodding in agreement, and the tension in the room was almost electric as David pivoted to the final and most damning component of his case, the personal financial transactions that Martha and certain board members had funneled from HOA funds into personal accounts, luxury items and vacations, all meticulously documented, all timed to coincide with the issuance of fines against families who resisted their authority, including the Johnsons. David presented a timeline, linking each improper expenditure to specific fines, juxtaposed against the neighborhood demographics, and the effect was devastating. Even Judge Whitaker's face betrayed the faintest flicker of recognition that the boy in front of him had systematically traced the pattern, connected the dots, and demonstrated not only the illegal behavior of the HOA, but also the direct consequences that had harmed innocent families. At this point, Martha Clarkson's defenses crumbled entirely, and she turned to her lawyers with pleading eyes, whispering frantic advice, but they were equally paralyzed, unable to reconcile the meticulous unraveling of their narrative. David, sensing the perfect moment, leaned forward and addressed the court with quiet authority. "Your Honor, it is clear that the Johnson family has been subjected to unjust, racially biased, and procedurally invalid fines and actions by the HOA board, actions that were sanctioned and perhaps overlooked by previous judicial oversight. And it is my position that immediate corrective measures are warranted to not only rectify these wrongs, but to prevent future abuse." The judge, his hands gripping the bench, finally spoke, his tone sharp and measured. "Mr. Johnson, the court will review this evidence carefully, but I must caution that accusations against the board and previous judicial actions carry serious implications." But David held his gaze steady, unflinching, and added, "Your Honor, with all due respect, the seriousness of these implications is precisely why I have prepared a full, documented record. We are not seeking vengeance, we are seeking justice. And the court's responsibility is to ensure the law is applied fairly, without bias and without fear or favor." The words reverberated through the room, striking every attendee with the force of undeniable logic. As the afternoon wore on, David proceeded to call expert witnesses, neighborhood surveyors, and even former HOA members who had resigned in disgust. And with each testimony, the narrative of a corrupt, overreaching, racially biased HOA solidified. By the time the day ended, it was no longer a courtroom drama about a single family's fight, but a public reckoning that threatened to topple years of unchecked power. And David's mastery of the law, his strategic calm, and his unwavering courage had transformed him from a teenager, underestimated by adults, into a legal force that commanded the attention and respect of every person in Maplewood Estates, leaving the HOA and even Judge Whitaker to confront the uncomfortable truth that the scales of justice were no longer theirs to tip, and that the Johnson family, guided by the genius of the young attorney, had not only survived the assault but had turned the tables in a way that would echo through the neighborhood, the courts, and every home where power had been misused, forever altering the balance of authority and sending a message that intelligence, preparation, and integrity could overcome arrogance, bias, and intimidation. By the time the court reconvened after lunch, the atmosphere had transformed from a routine civil hearing into something closer to a public spectacle, with the gallery swollen with neighbors who had once kept their heads down but were now curious, almost hungry, to see how far the teenager would go in dismantling the mighty HOA. And as Judge Whitaker rapped his gavel and ordered everyone to settle, the reporters' pens were already scratching furiously, sensing history was being written. In real time, David rose from his chair with the same unshaken poise he had shown all morning, but this time there was a sharper glint in his eyes, as if he were about to draw blood. And when he called his next witness age, OA Board Secretary Linda Hall, there was an audible shift in the room, because unlike Martha, Linda didn't strut or sneer, looked pale, nervous, her eyes darting from the board members to the spectators as if silently begging to be spared. David, however, offered no mercy. His questions were precise, cutting through her hesitant answers like a scalpel, pressing her to confirm signatures on letters, approvals on fines, and the timelines of meetings. And with each document he slid across the stand, Linda's face fell further until finally she blurted, "We didn't always vote on the fines. Martha just told us to sign off." And the gasp that erupted from the crowd was like a wave crashing against stone walls. "So, to be clear," David said, his voice steady, "the fines against my family weren't even approved through proper procedure." Linda, sweating, nodded quickly, and when David followed with, "And you knew that was against the HOA bylaws?" she buried her face in her hands and whispered, "Yes," before bursting into tears. The bailiff had to bring her water, and Martha leapt from her chair, hissing that Linda was lying, that she was just bitter. But the damage was done. The image of Martha's power began to fracture. The perception of an untouchable board now riddled with holes. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his once dismissive gaze now focused like a hawk on Martha. And though he didn't say it aloud, his tightening jaw betrayed that even he was starting to question whether he had underestimated the boy in the cheap suit and scuffed shoes. But David wasn't finished. He pivoted quickly, calling attention to a set of photographs he projected on the screen, snapshots of other neighbors' gardens, fences, and sheds, many of which violated the same rules Martha had used to fine the Johnsons. Yet none of those families had ever received a single citation. And when David highlighted that all of those families were white, the courtroom froze in a collective recognition of what had long been whispered but never proven. "Discrimination. Mrs. Clarkson," David said, turning sharply to Martha, who sat rigid in her chair. "Can you explain why the Simmons family's white picket fence, clearly outside the approved color palette, was never fined?" Martha stammered about community cohesion, but David pressed again with another photo, this time of the Millers' unpermitted gazebo. "And why did the Millers face no fines for this structure?" Martha sputtered, unable to form a coherent defense, and David drove in the knife. "Is it possible, Mrs. Clarkson, that your enforcement of the rules is not about rules at all, but about who lives behind them?" The silence was deafening, the words hanging like a guillotine above Martha's head. And for the first time, the judge didn't reprimand David for being bold. He simply stared at Martha with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. The board members beside her began to sweat, some exchanging nervous glances, and Greg, the treasurer David had grilled earlier, whispered something under his breath that made Martha shoot him a glare sharp enough to kill. But David caught it and seized the opportunity. Your Honor, I move that we enter into the record Exhibit G. Financial records showing that Mr. Greg Peterson attempted to resign from the board twice last year due to ethical concerns, letters which mysteriously never reached the homeowners, he said, holding up 2 crumpled resignation letters. Greg had quietly slipped to David during the recess, and the judge allowed it, his expression hardening further. At that moment, it was no longer the Johnson family on trial, it was the HOA itself, their every lie unraveling like a poorly tied knot. And the gallery was buzzing with energy, neighbors whispering to one another about their own experiences, about fines they'd been afraid to fight, about letters they'd received that suddenly seemed questionable. And David's words lit a spark of rebellion in them, a collective realization that the emperor had no clothes. Martha, however, was not the type to surrender gracefully. Her face twisted with fury, and she snapped, "This is outrageous. This is nothing but a stunt. He's a child. He can't possibly understand contract law." But before Judge Whitaker could respond, David lifted a thick binder, opened a highlighted ruling, and said, "Your Honor, with respect, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Johnson v. Cypress, HOA, a precedent from this very state in which the court ruled that selective enforcement of HOA rules constitutes unlawful discrimination and invalidates the fines imposed. Would you like me to read the holding, or should we accept that Martha Clarkson has already violated the exact conditions outlined therein?" The gallery gasped again, and even the judge's eyes widened. He nodded slowly for David to continue, and as David recited the case with flawless precision, it became clear to everyone in the room that this boy wasn't bluffing. He had studied, he had prepared, and he had the law on his side. By now, reporters were tweeting live updates, phrases like teen dismantles, HOA, and judge stunned by 16-year-old legal prodigy lighting up the internet. And though Martha tried to regain control by shouting objections, they were hollow, easily overruled, until finally her voice cracked with desperation. "This is ridiculous. This family doesn't belong here. They don't respect our standards. They've brought down the value of every home in Maplewood." The words spilled out in a fit of rage, raw and unfiltered, and in that instant, the entire room heard the truth beneath her years of veiled hostility. David didn't even need to say anything. The silence spoke volumes as everyone realized what Martha had just admitted, and when David finally whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Clarkson, for revealing your true motive," it landed like a hammer blow. The judge's face hardened, and he turned to the stenographer. "Let the record reflect that statement," he ordered, his voice low, and Martha's lawyers buried their faces in their hands, knowing the case had just slipped beyond saving. But David wasn't done, not yet. He calmly returned to his table, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a final document, sliding it onto the judge's desk with the precision of a chess master making his endgame move. "Your Honor, this is a petition signed by 35 residents of Maplewood Estates, attesting to harassment, selective enforcement, and financial misconduct by the HOA board. These signatures were collected over the last 2 weeks, and every one of them tells the same story. What my family endured was not an isolated incident, but a pattern of abuse designed to enrich the board while intimidating homeowners." Judge scanned the pages, his frown deepening with every line, and the murmurs in the gallery swelled into outright outrage. Neighbors who had once feared speaking up were now emboldened, some even standing to shout their support until the bailiff had to order them to sit. For the first time in years, Martha Clarkson looked small, diminished, her empire crumbling around her as the teenager she mocked stood taller than anyone else in the room. And though the judge called for a recess to review the evidence, the outcome was already clear to everyone present. The HOA was cornered, its corruption exposed, its leader undone, and the boy they had dismissed as a child had just proven himself not only capable but brilliant, wielding the law like a blade. As David sat back beside his parents, his mother squeezed his hand with tears in her eyes, whispering, "Your grandfather would be so proud." And David, though still outwardly calm, allowed himself the smallest smile because he knew section 3 of his battle was complete. The truth had been revealed, the lies torn apart. And all that remained was the final reckoning, when judgment would fall not on his family,
but on the corrupt system that had tried to break them.
The silence that lingered after David's bold declaration was like a drawn bowstring. Every eye in the courtroom locked on the teenager who stood with the calm posture of someone twice his age. And when Judge Whitaker finally muttered for the plaintiff to begin, Martha Clarkson all but leaped to her feet, eager to make a mockery of the Johnson family. She strutted to the witness stand, clutching a stack of documents that she waved dramatically. And with a sugary tone that dripped venom, she declared that the Johnsons had knowingly and repeatedly violated Maplewood Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions, painting a picture of a family who refused to follow rules, who thumbed their nose at authority, and who had turned a respectable neighborhood into what she called an eyesore of non-compliance. But as she rattled off her accusations, unapproved landscaping, unpaid fines, legal structures that turned out to be nothing more than a garden shed, David's pen scratched steadily across his notepad, his face unreadable except for the faint flicker of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. When Martha finished, theatrically slamming her folder onto the stand and glaring at the Johnsons as though she had already won, the judge gestured lazily and said, "Defense, your cross-examination," expecting perhaps a timid shuffle of words, maybe even silence, but instead David rose, buttoned his jacket, and strode toward Martha with the measured confidence of a seasoned litigator. "Mrs. Clarkson," he began, his voice calm but edged with steel, "you claim my family's landscaping is unapproved. Can you point this court to the specific bylaw that forbids azaleas or sunflowers?" Martha blinked, caught off guard, then fumbled with her papers, mumbling something about community aesthetic standards. David seized the moment, slamming a copy of the official HOA bylaws onto the podium. "For the record, Your Honor, I have the Maplewood Estates covenants right here, and no, we're not in landscaping. It's not in exterior design, not in community guidelines. Does it prohibit the planting of flowers? In fact, Section 4, subsection B, explicitly allows homeowners to maintain gardens so long as they do not obstruct sidewalks, which ours does not." Gasps rippled through the gallery as David flipped to the highlighted section and read it aloud, with precision, leaving Martha sputtering as though her tongue had tripped on its own lies. "Next," David continued smoothly, "you fined us $200 for an improper fence color. Yet according to Exhibit C filed by your own board, the approved color palette includes earth tones and neutrals. Is brown no longer a neutral color, Mrs. Clarkson, or do the rules bend only when applied to certain households?" Martha's face flushed crimson, and the judge frowned, suddenly less amused, while the stenographer's keys clattered furiously to keep up. And finally, David pressed, his tone sharpening, "You accused us of illegal modifications for a structure in our yard. Can you confirm for this court what that structure is?" Martha shifted uncomfortably before muttering, "Shed. A large shed," and David pounced, slamming down a building permit stamped and approved by the county office. "This shed, Your Honor, was approved and permitted by the county inspector months before the HOA issued its fine-making. This not only a false accusation, but a blatant abuse of power designed to financially harass my family." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Whitaker banged his gavel for order. But not before several spectators were whispering that maybe this boy knew exactly what he was doing after all. Martha tried to regain control, hissing that the Johnsons just didn't fit with the neighborhood standards. But David cut her off with a line so sharp it silenced even the judge. "Is it that our garden doesn't fit, Mrs. Clarkson, or that our family doesn't?" The weight of the question hung heavy in the air, because everyone knew what Martha had never said aloud, but had always implied. And the shift in the room was palpable, the smug smirks on the HOA board members' faces slowly dissolving into unease as they realized this teenager was cornering them, not with emotion but with facts, law, and strategy. Over the next 2 hours, David dismantled every fine one by one, calling up receipts, permits, photographs, and even testimony from neighbors who had been quietly supportive but too afraid to speak against Martha until now. Each cross-examination exposed contradictions in the HOA's case. Each question peeled back the layers of prejudice and corruption that had festered under the surface of Maplewood Estates. And with each revelation, the gallery's whispers grew louder, until Judge Whitaker had to snap at the crowd to maintain order, though even he could no longer hide his surprise at how easily this boy was running circles around adults who had expected to crush him. When it was time for David to call his first witness, he shocked everyone by summoning not a neighbor or even a family member, but the HOA's own treasurer, a nervous man named Greg, who shuffled to the stand sweating bullets. With surgical precision, David questioned him about the HOA's finances, about where the thousands collected in fines had gone, and when Greg stumbled over his answers, David slid forward copies of financial statements he had obtained through a Freedom of Information request. Documents that showed not only inconsistencies in the HOA's spending, but also that Martha had authorized payments from HOA funds to cover personal expenses, including landscaping for her own yard and a luxury vacation labeled as a conference. The room gasped audibly, and Martha sprang to her feet, shouting objections, but David was relentless, reading line after line until the judge's face darkened with suspicion. "Are you saying, young man, that this board has been embezzling funds from homeowners?" Judge Whitaker asked cautiously, and David locked eyes with him before replying. "I'm not saying it, Your Honor, their own records are." A thunderclap of murmurs rolled through the room. Reporters scribbled frantically, and Martha looked like she might collapse right there in her seat. By the time the session recessed for lunch, the entire balance of power had shifted. What had begun as a smug attempt to humiliate the Johnson family had turned into a public trial of the HOA itself. And though Judge Whitaker tried to maintain an air of neutrality, even he couldn't help but glance at David with something approaching respect, though tinged with wariness, as if he realized too late that the boy he had mocked might very well flip this case upside down. As the Johnson family stepped out into the hallway, cameras flashed and reporters swarmed, shouting questions like, "David, how did you learn the law? Do you think you can win against the HOA?" And though Mrs. Johnson tried to shield her son from the frenzy, David answered with calm confidence, "It's not about winning, it's about justice, and making sure no one else has to go through what we did." Those words struck like lightning, spreading across social media within hours. And by the time court reconvened that afternoon, the courtroom was packed wall-to-wall with onlookers eager to see if the teenager could keep up his momentum, while, inside, Martha whispered frantically to her lawyers, demanding they crush him. But deep down she knew that every trick she had relied on for years was crumbling under the weight of his preparation and brilliance. And the more she fought, the more tangled she became in her own lies. And as David straightened his tie once more and prepared to begin the next round of questioning, there was a glint in his eye that promised the HOA hadn't yet seen the full scope of what he was capable of. For he wasn't just defending his family and amour, he was setting the stage to topple an empire of corruption that had hidden behind neighborhood rules. And soon, even the judge who had mocked him would have no choice but to acknowledge the genius attorney standing before him. In disguise, the gavel slammed down like a thunderclap, and the entire courtroom froze as the judge leaned forward with a smirk and said, "Son, this is no place for childish games. Why don't you sit down and let the grown-ups handle the law?" But what no one in that stuffy chamber realized, not the smirking HOA board members lined up in their suits, not the smug president with her pearl necklace glittering in the fluorescent lights, not even the bailiff who was trying to stifle a laugh, was that the so-called child standing in front of them was about to unleash a storm of legal brilliance they weren't prepared to face, because he wasn't just a teenager dragged into court by a power-hungry homeowners association. He was a genius who had spent years studying case law loopholes and statutes while everyone else his age was busy playing video games, and he had walked into that courtroom not as a victim, but as an executioner with a briefcase full of evidence, sharp enough to slice through every lie, every fraudulent fine, every discriminatory tactic the HOA had weaponized against his family simply because they were black and refused to bow to intimidation in their own neighborhood. It had all begun 6 months earlier, on a humid summer morning in Maplewood Estates, a suburban development with manicured lawns and a sprawling community pool, where the self-important HOA president stood on the sidewalk glaring. At the Johnson family's garden, as though it were a crime scene, Mrs. Johnson had planted a row of vibrant azaleas and sunflowers that stretched along their fence, and while most neighbors admired the color it brought to the block, Martha saw it as an affront to her power, because the Johnsons were the only black family in the neighborhood, and Martha made it her mission to remind them that their presence would always be under scrutiny. Letters started first, then envelopes slid into the mailbox with fines written in stiff, bureaucratic language: $150 for unapproved landscaping, $200 for improper fence color, $300 for excessive use of outdoor space when the Johnson kids played basketball in their own driveway, and, though the Johnsons tried to protest politely at first, writing back with copies of the HOA's own bylaws showing no such rules existed, their appeals were always denied with curt notes, signed by Martha herself, as if she alone were judge, jury, and executioner in Maplewood Estates. Mr. Johnson, a hard-working mechanic, was too busy juggling long shifts at the garage to fight every petty fine, and Mrs. Johnson, a schoolteacher, tried to shield her children from the stress. But the harassment only grew bolder, threats of liens on their property, warnings taped to their door, even Martha's cronies snapping photos of their house at night with flash cameras like paparazzi trying to catch a scandal, till the youngest of the Johnson kids, 16-year-old David, decided he couldn't watch in silence anymore. David was not like most teenagers. Ever since he was little, he devoured books on law and justice. Sitting in the corner of the library while his classmates played outside, and though his teachers had often marveled at his sharp mind, one realized just how far his obsession had gone. For in his room he kept binders full of printed case law, highlighted rulings, and handwritten notes mapping out legal strategies like a general plotting a war. And when Martha Clarkson finally crossed the line, issuing a massive fine of $10,000 for illegal modifications to the Johnsons' property and filing for a court order to begin foreclosure proceedings, David knew the time had come to reveal the weapon he had been secretly sharpening for years: himself. The day they walked into the county courthouse was the day Maplewood Estates became the stage for a battle far larger than petty HOA politics. Reporters had gathered because the case involved racial discrimination allegations. Neighbors whispered in the gallery, and Martha strutted in with her board members as though she were queen, sneering when she saw David carrying a battered leather briefcase at his side, a gift from his late grandfather who had once dreamed of being a lawyer. "What is this?" Martha scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. They brought their little boy to play dress-up in court, and the board members chuckled, feeding off her arrogance, while David simply adjusted his tie he had learned to knot from watching hours of courtroom footage. Jan took his place at the defense table beside his stunned parents. The judge, Harold Whitaker, finally entered. He was already predisposed. Known for his impatience and his old-fashioned views, he glanced at David with thinly veiled disdain and said, "Counselor, I see no licensed attorney here." But David rose to his full height and replied in a steady voice that cut through the murmurs, "Your Honor, under state law, individuals have the right to represent themselves in civil proceedings, and I intend to do exactly that on behalf of my family, lest the court wishes to deny us the same access to justice afforded to any citizen." The room went silent. Even the stenographer's fingers paused above the keys. The judge cleared his throat, clearly annoyed, but he couldn't deny the legality of David's claim. So he waved dismissively and muttered, "Proceed, but don't waste this court's time." And from that moment, the stage was set, a teenager against a multi-million-dollar HOA. A supposed child against seasoned adults who thought the law was theirs to bend. And every person in that chamber believed David would be crushed before the day was out. But David had spent nights memorizing precedent, days combing through every fraudulent bylaw Martha had slipped into the HOA rulebook, and hours crafting arguments that would unravel their entire scheme. What none of them expected was that this boy, mocked for his age and underestimated because of his race, was about to use their own arrogance as the rope that would hang them in front of everyone they had sought to impress. And by the time his first cross-examination was done, the whispers in the gallery would swell into gasps of disbelief, because this was not a boy playing lawyer, this was a genius attorney in disguise. and the HOA was about to regret every fine, every threat, every ounce of prejudice they had hurled at the Johnson family.